first 30 years, India kind of fell back relative to, other countries in the world?
I think we have to just look at our neighborhood to see the degree of turmoil, the disorder which sets countries back.
If you take inflation over the last 75 years, India is amongst the lowest in the developing world.
Hello and welcome to this special program on DeKoder. I'm Nidhi Razdan. We all know that India is the fastest growing major economy in the world. But the India story is much more than just the GDP numbers and how the stock markets are doing. All these decades after independence, we have to ask, has India really achieved what it set out to do? Have we done enough to uplift the poorest of the poor out of poverty? Have we done enough for the entire population, not just on economic indices, but human development indices as well? We have to ask whether in 2025, why we aren't able to create good quality, high paying jobs for a huge young population that we have, a demographic that should work to our advantage. Of course, there are so many things that are going right for India as well. And that is why we are doing well compared to a lot of other developing economies, especially at a time when the world is in so much upheaval, thanks to Donald Trump. There is a new book that we're going to talk about today. It's called, and I'm going to lift it up here, A Sixth of Humanity, written by Arvind Subramanian and Devesh Kapur. Two of the finest authors for a book like this, which is, I think, like an encyclopedia, a research book for anyone who wants to understand India's political, economic, and social trajectory right from independence until now. What are the choices that India made back in 1947 that shaped the country to be what it is today? In terms of the politics, the political path that it chose, economic policies from socialism to the economic reforms of 91, how politics has changed today. This book has it all as it comprehensively looks at the trajectory of India and what India needs to do now in the coming decades. And let me introduce the authors in some more detail. First, Arvind Subramanian is, of course, the former chief economic advisor to the government of India and currently senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. Devesh Kapur is the Star Foundation Professor of South Asia Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. It is wonderful to have both of you with us on DeKoder today, and many congratulations for the book.
Thanks, Nidhi. Thanks for having us.
So I wanted to begin by asking any of you this question, maybe Arvind Subramanian first. The book is very detailed in tracking, as I said, India's trajectory right from the socialist era to globalization. When you look, let me ask a general question. When you look at where India is today and where the India story is today, how would you sum it up? I mean, I just want to quote a line from the book where you said, across several indicators, India's performance has been decidedly modest over 75 years. So in a way, the sense I got is that the book is a very sobering account of where we are.
Yeah. First of all, it's hard to summarize performance over multiple dimensions, over multiple periods of time. But in our concluding chapter, what we broadly say is that if you look just at growth and, which is like a proxy for dynamism, the first 30 years kind of set us back. And all these measurements that we do or the assessments that we do are not just comparing India across time, but also India across time relative to other countries as well, which is maybe the fairest and broadest comparison. So on dynamism, which we capture by, the average standard of living, we find that in the first 30 years, India kind of fell back relative to, other countries in the world. And India began at something like, the bottom third. It slipped further. And after 1980, of course, it has made tremendous strides and it's improved its relative ranking. But it's still, well below the median, i.e. India is still not amongst the top 50 percentile of the richest countries in the world measured in terms of per capita GDP. But on the broader human development indicator story, the picture is, in fact, a bit more sobering. That not only have we not caught up, not only did the first 3 decades set us back, but the subsequent, 3 or 4 decades, we've caught up, but not really, and we still very much in the bottom half of a variety of human development indicators. Uh, but of course, all that being said, we should also acknowledge some of the major achievements of India, which is, and I'm going to ask Devesh to speak on this, which is, democracy, building a nation order. Let me hand it over to Devesh on all these other things.
Go ahead,
Thanks,
Devesh.
Arvind. So I think, as Arvind said, you know, something as complex over such an extended period of time, having very simple assessments is very hard. But I think we need to acknowledge what the foundations of weaving together the fabric of the nation, as well as state building. All of these, because of establishing a strong foundation of the democracy, these were very helpful for the growth we see in the later decades. I think we have to just look at our neighborhood to see the degree of turmoil, the disorder which sets countries back, right? If you look at the constituent countries of British India, Pakistan broke apart. Sri Lanka has been racked by internal conflict over many years. Although Nepal was not part of British India, but we see upheaval there too. Myanmar, Burma, now Myanmar, was part of British India, and you can see the deep sort of conflicts sort of raging there. India has avoided all of this for the most part, and that is an achievement which is really a towering achievement which is not acknowledged.
Nidhi, I just want to build upon what, because it's important, because we're looking at, the world more broadly at a time of turmoil. The point that Devesh just said about how India achieved this amazing order and avoided disorder, I think there's a broader lesson that we should send to the West as well here. See, we forget, or the West tends to conveniently forget, that when they embarked upon building a nation, building a country, it happened under conditions of extreme violence, genocide, exclusion, etc. And one of the things we show in the book, there's a great line by a French philosopher saying, every document of civilization is also a document of barbarism. But India, in the process of creating a sense of nationhood, trying to achieve, a modicum of order, which paved the way for all of India's subsequent achievements, it was done with relatively little violence, relatively little chaos. And one of the distinguishing features of India, not just on the political side, but also on the economic side, is how much less disorder we have than other countries, other developing countries. Just to give an example, if you take inflation over the last 75 years, India is amongst the lowest in the developing world. So these are achievements that should not be neglected, and these are achievements relative to the neighborhood, but also relative to developed countries at a comparable point in their development.
I'm going to just go point by point on some of the issues that you raised, because they're all, as you said, complex, they're important, and I do definitely want to discuss how our politics in particular has transformed, and the state of our democracy, which you've written about as well. But it's interesting, and I want to bring up the example, Devesh Kapur, of the just concluded Bihar election. When you look at the contradictions in India, now here is a state which is by far the poorest state in India. The per capita GDP is still so low. Nitish Kumar, though, has been chief minister now for nearly 20 years, and he's going to be sworn in again very soon. And this, despite having no industry, no investment in Bihar, he has overwhelmingly won again along with the BJP. Now, what explains this according to you? Is it just something as simple as putting 10,000 rupees in the hands of women voters, or is it something more complex than that?
Well, it's never, I mean, elections in India are never a simple minded story of, a silver bullet that wins elections. I mean, look, one important factor we should never forget in electoral context is it's not just how good you are, but how good or how bad is the opposition, right? I mean, voters are looking at not just what is the best alternative, but sometimes what is the least worst alternative. And the fact is that you know if you think about Bihar, and sort of everyone has this memory of the jungle Raj of the Lalu years. I think we should also forget what that decade achieved, which is that a feudal order in Bihar, which had held back that state, that had to be crushed. And any time you try and break a feudal order, it's never simple, it's always messy. So in some ways that was a necessary transition for Bihar to sort of break the feudal order. Not that it's completely broken, but it's much weaker than what it was. Now it'll take some time for Bihar to now look, instead of trying to break with the past, to have a more future looking policy. Our own sense is that there is a possibility that actually the Bihar is going somewhat in a very light way the Kerala model, which we highlight in the book. Kerala didn't do well in agriculture, it didn't do well in industry, it didn't do well in services, but it is, of course, an outstanding sort of example of like development in India. And that is because it exported labor, first somewhat within India, but of course mainly in the Gulf.
In the Gulf,
And we
yeah.
see that in sort of Bihar as well now, right? It's exporting labor to the rest of the country. But also, we forget there is a lot of international migration of labor happening from Bihar. The Gulf is no longer migrants from Kerala. It's barely 5%. It's UP and Bihar. You can see labor from Bihar in Africa. You can see them in Greece. You can see them in Korea. So maybe the Bihar model might be a different model, but it's hard to say right now because it is at that transition stage.
Nidhi, can I just add to, to me, in some ways, what is happening in Bihar, one could say, kind of encapsulates a little bit what we say in the book about democracy more broadly. Right, just we are maybe we're being a little bit too cute, but in the book we compare democracy to liquid oxygen. That famous line that the liquid won't allow you to die, won't allow you to live, and the oxygen won't allow you to die. And let me elaborate in the Bihar case, right? So democracy as a way of providing representation, order, breaking down some of the feudal things that Devesh spoke about. I think it's wonderful, and to some extent that has happened as well. But then we can't get over around the fact that it has also posed its challenges. And let me highlight just one of them, right? I mean, there's no doubt that in the last at least 5-10 years, democracy and what's happening in the states has become a source of competitive populism. One state says we'll give you 2,000 rupees for the Mahila, other state says 3,000, Bihar says 10,000, one state says 100 units free electricity. So we can't deny this competitive populism at work, which partly has to do with democratic politics as well. But
Is it a bad
what?
thing though?
Sorry, I mean that's unambiguously. I think it's some of it may be necessary, like providing a basic income, but beyond a point, it leads to fiscal recklessness, and it leads to a neglect of providing public goods like health, education, etc. But the last point I want to make is that you know one can either be hopeful, as Devesh has been, saying, look, we're at a cusp, some minimum things have been established, and therefore we can look beyond. But there is something profoundly depressing also, and let's not overlook that, because if you look at even the campaigning in Bihar, it was still, Indian politics still is dominated by, caste census, freebies, reveries, and even when it comes to jobs, is government jobs. Even the Congress party, which bequeathed 25, 30 years of rapid growth, employment creation, even that has abandoned all those things. So in some ways, the political imagination in India is still stuck in the old easy policy instruments, to the neglect of an imagination that says, how can we expand the pie? How can we get more productivity? How can we provide more jobs? How can we
I
provide more private investment?
I
And so
agree
on.
with you saying, and the problem is that when someone like, let's say, Prashant Kishore, who came in on a platform to say, look, I don't want to talk about caste, I want to talk about how we can create jobs, but then he bombed, right? So there is a certain reality, I think, of Indian society that maybe our politics also reflects. But another important point that you made, and Arvind Subramanian, coming to that, staying on that point of democracy, is that in the book you talk about how the Indian state has become today more illiberal, opaque, authoritarian, and majoritarian. And you say we don't quite yet know what the consequences of that will be. So when we talk about in India, where there is order today compared to our neighbors, that we're much better off than our neighborhood, this clearly is a concern that you have flagged, because we don't know how this could play out.
So I think, in fact, we end the book by saying, if you look at the arc of Indian, development over 75 years, as Devesh, outlined, our democracy, both the achievement of democracy, the sustenance of democracy, and then how democracy has played a key role in creating order, nation building, etc., were early successes. The early failures were the inability to, create a dynamic economy, inability to provide public health, basic education, and build state capacity and infrastructure. But over time, we have caught up on some of those things. As Devesh has said, our state capacity is much better than before. We have better roads, infrastructure, ports, and we also have a social safety net now that we couldn't have imagined even 10 years ago. However, at the very time when we're getting those accomplishments, the early successes are under threat, i.e., the early success of, a plural, inclusive, pluralist, inclusive society, and so on. And what we conclude the book by saying is that, please do no harm, or, if we can just maintain those early successes, then 1.4 billion entrepreneurial Indians, rely on them, have confidence in them, but don't squander those early successes, because if you get disorder, if you get conflict, if you get social fissures, I think many of the possibilities of India will be constricted, unfortunately.
Another line which again stood out to me in the book, Devesh Kapur, was again, sort of on this theme of democracy, was where you say that the Achilles heel of India's democracy has been tattered accountability mechanisms that permeate from all, everything in our lives, to from corruption to criminal behavior, from exam leaks to encounter killings, from pollution to the police. And I just wanted you to talk about that, because you're absolutely right. I mean, I am sitting in Delhi right now, which is a total gas chamber. And because of air pollution, which is just somehow not a political issue, and we outrage over it 2-3 months in a year, and then the buck gets passed on. There's some finger pointing, and no one does anything about it. So we don't seem to even desire accountability, I feel, at some point.
I think one of the, uh, I mean, one might say downsides of the democracy is that we have reduced the democracy to elections.
Yes.
And So our main mechanism of accountability, if not the sole mechanism, is now that if I won the elections, that shows that is enough accountability, rather than what happens between elections. So, outcome, because we think that we have procedural legitimacy, which is through elections, we care much less about outcome based legitimacy. And, as we point out, highlighting the issue of air pollution in Delhi, this is where India's power elite lives, the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch. The first time the Supreme Court, looked at this began 40 years ago. There are enough, studies showing how much it contributes to much higher morbidity and mortality. We are talking of millions of additional deaths because of the health consequences. And yet, the passing of the buck is extraordinary, right? And we point out that, look, issues like air pollution, this is where you really need strong cooperative federalism, but you also need the state working with society, with because the sources are, of course, whether it's farmers or people burning solid waste, whether it is the role of cars in Delhi or farm fires in Punjab. It's a very complex problem. Let's have no doubt about that. But precisely when something is complex, you need to have really strong cooperative federalism. So, as Arvind pointed out, if you weaken cooperative federalism, you will be unable to address some of the key challenges that India is facing. The same thing we will face with our water, which is becoming a scarce resource. It's very hard to get states to agree on river water, sharing of aquifers. So all of these just really highlight the argument we make that, look, the structures and institutions of federalism, if you weaken them, you will not be able to solve some of your most pressing problems.
Unfortunately, that is the case, that they are much weaker today. We can see that. We can see an attempt to over centralize everything, to get governors to sort of run roughshod on elected governments, state governments, union territory governments. And that's a separate book by itself. I do want to ask you, Arvind Subramanian, about human development indices, which you talked about in your first answer. And again, you've talked about the fact that we just don't have accurate data that measures this growing inequality in India. And how much of a problem is that really? Because again, this is a model I think Trump has borrowed from us. When you don't like something, don't release the data, or just fire the person who did release it. But how important is it to have accurate data out there?
I mean, by the way, I mean, it goes without saying that if you can't measure something properly, you don't know what the problem is, how much the problem is, and also then therefore don't know how to respond to it. So I think it's just a self-evident that we need better data across the board. And by the way, this is not just happening in India. Today's Financial Times article has a big piece on how China's GDP data is no longer easy to measure, and we've seen in the United States also there's now a withholding of data. The general trend toward illiberalism globally seems to be going hand in hand with a kind of or disinclination on the part of state authorities to be more transparent about data and to produce better data. But I think Nidhi, you were asking two questions. I think one was about data and one was about inequality. Because remember, the inability to measure well is not just restricted to inequality, or even inequality. It happens across the board. But on the inequality question, I mean, if was that a question that you wanted me to address?
Yes.
See, I think one has to be a little bit careful here. And I would say something somewhat controversial here, that I think intellectuals around the world are getting, kind of placing a lot of premium on inequality as the big problem around the world. Now, I think we need to be a little bit careful here. I think inequality, A, is very difficult to measure, one. Moreover, in India, the inequality that matters may not be the inequality that matters in the United States or Europe. For example, we are much more concerned about, the divergences across castes, across religions, or even across regions in India. And therefore, we should be careful about importing, this whole inequality debate as it comes from the West. We have to fashion for ourselves what is important. For example, one could make the case in India that inequality is per se is not the problem, but poverty and, the fate of people at the bottom, especially providing jobs for women. So gender is another axis of inequality that's much more important. So I think this is just a cautionary note to say that, just because people in the West make, inequality an important. For example, yesterday I think Piketty said that the United Nations should start a commission like against climate change. We should have something on inequality. We should be careful about these things, because what matters for us, what kinds of inequality matters, how we must respond is kind of very different from what it might happen in the West. So it's a kind of also the point I want to make is that we should have this intellectual independence and self reliance to determine for ourselves what is important and what is not.
Last,
Nidhi, if
yeah,
I
go
could
ahead.
add to that, just on the data. One is, I think we should be careful in thinking that the data challenges in India are only at the center. Uh, I think it is true. I think the postponement of the census was to next year was really sort of unwarranted despite COVID. But much of the data that is weak is because states have not invested. Take a simple thing like the recording of births and deaths, right? That's the most basic data that any state needs to know, what is happening. And so many states have done such a poor job in that most basic data apparatus. So I think we should be careful in not sort of putting the onus of the data challenges only on the center. The states have much to ask for as well.
Let me ask both of you this final question, and Arvind Subramaniam, you can answer it first. Uh, as you mentioned, you see in India today that we want to be the best at everything. We want to build the best trains, the best stations, the best. We want to build the biggest cities, airports, etc., statues also. And obviously, India is today a very, very aspirational country, right? You see that at the village level, small towns, even in big cities, everyone wants to do better. They aspire to do better. And do you think that that is what is ultimately going to drive real change and accelerate that change, where people are demanding more, they're demanding better, and maybe that's what finally leads us to create those well-paid jobs that you've been talking about that we don't have at the moment.
So yeah, I think that if you were to ask what has fundamentally changed in India since 1980, for example, right? I mean, you could say many things, but I think one of the fundamental things that's changed is this whole what people call the revolution of rising expectations. Once India started doing well, the sense that why could we, we can do things well and we can do things as well as anyone else. So the aspirations changed, and India started benchmarking itself against the rest of the world, which is, I think, an eminently desirable thing. Now, one statistic, Nidhi would like to point out that I think speaks to your question is if you look after 1980, we think that, we've not done as well as China, which is true. But after 1980, what we show in the book is that one third of India, basically the southern states and the peninsular states, Gujarat and Haryana, grew as rapidly as China and for almost as long. So the question not is whether we can, with this, with this entrepreneurial aspirational India, the question is not whether we can, create something dynamic and beautiful in India. One third of India has already done it. So maybe the question really is not whether India can do it, but how what one third of India has done can be transmitted to the remaining two thirds of India, especially in the Hindi heartland. And that puts a different spin on both what we've done and what we can do, given India's 1.4 billion hustling Indians, as it were.
So, Devesh Kapur, why is it that the Hindi heartland is not or has not been able to catch up with what the southern states have done, for example?
So, Nidhi, one is that I think we forget that in the South, it was very important that social movements to change society, demand for education, that preceded universal franchise. So, in other words, there were these movements from the Justice Party to the movements in Kerala and Tamil Nadu. So, what you see is that the structures of society have to change, and the state, so it has to be both a bottom up process as well as a top down. In UP Bihar, because the bottom up processes were much weak, the burden fell entirely on the state, and therefore the incentives to capture the state were very, very strong. And so it's taken much, much longer for the sorts of social changes that have occurred in the South to occur in the North. But we do, of course, see that happening. I mean, we talked about Bihar. Bihar's social structures today are a far cry from what they were 40 years ago. It doesn't mean they're equal, but they're definitely less sort of unequal than it was. I think the question you had on aspirations, I mean, the tragedy is that the young people, they have all these aspirations, but the imagination of India's politics, as Arvind pointed out, is still locked into identity politics. And frankly, that's true of many of India's intellectuals as well. They are obsessed with religion and caste, whereas the aspirations of the young, right, are to have better jobs, better lives in so many ways. And it's that mismatch between what young people want and what the constricted imagination of the political class, that sort of is creating many of these challenges.
So Nidhi, just last, just building on what Devesh just said, right? I mean, our book is about looking backwards, mostly with a view to speaking to the future. And we always say, oh, we must learn from our mistakes so that we don't repeat it. But, we also seem to have forgotten our successes. We were so successful for about 25, 30 years in providing jobs, in creating a better state. So I think there's as much to learn from our successes as from our mistakes in terms of expanding this imagination of India's politicians and intellectuals, as Devesh said.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. And as I said, I think the book is rich with research and perspectives on all of these issues. A must read, I think, for anyone who really wants to understand India today and India's past in the last 70, 75 years. Congratulations again, Arvind Subramanian, Devesh Kapur. It was wonderful to talk to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us. Thanks.
And that's it on this special edition on Decoder. See you another time.